Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name's Alasdair. I am the head of gardens and estate at Halligan, and whereas both Susan and Michelle have sort of given us a great introduction, but we're here really to talk about Halligan's past, present, and future. Already we've got off to a terrible start, as you can see with this first slide, because I am clearly not Candy Smith. I apologize for that, as does Candy, who unfortunately is not well today at all. So I will also ask your forgiveness because I'm going to read her presentation. Now, this is her presentation. I've done a little bit of editing, but the occasional hiccup may occur as I describe myself as Tim Smith's wife and the mother of his children by mistake. So forgive me if this happens, but I'm sure you will understand. So the first photograph that I'm showing you today is an aerial shot of Halligan taken in year 2000 after the restoration. It should give you a bit of a sense of the size of Halligan Estate, which is 200 acres. There's a variety of habitats with the gardens in the foreground. But let us start at the beginning. So in 1990, Tim Smith, a successful songwriter and musician, moved from London to Cornwall. And Tim was looking for some land to start a farm for rare breed animals, and was introduced to John Willis, who is a descendant of the Cornish Tremaine family, which owned Halligan for 400 years, who had just inherited responsibility for their long neglected but formerly reputable gardens. The Tremaines had first moved to Halligan around 1600, and Halligan House and Gardens were then developed for over 3 centuries by resident squires until the outbreak of the First World War. In this photograph, you can see in the center Halligan House with the walled garden, melon yard, and kitchen garden to the north, which is actually unhelpfully the bottom of the photograph. You can also see around the productive areas the ornamental gardens, so wonderfully described by Susan, and then further beyond the house is another ornamental area known as the jungle. But back to the far past. So here we have a photograph of an Edwardian garden party at Halligan. Hospitality, both to the gentry and to the local community, entailed the development of trend-setting exotic Victorian pleasure grounds, but also the year-round management of productive areas. These included a walled garden built of Flemish brick in around 1800, with south-facing glass houses, photographs of which you've seen already, and a 1.8-acre kitchen garden dating to around 1830. Squire Jack Tremaine inherited in 1901, and at that point the gardens were in their late Victorian heyday, enjoying a national reputation. And this is a photograph of his sort of first jamboree. This is an image of the Halligan Estate Labour Book, and they recorded not only jobs done daily and the paydays, but also staff enlistment to serve in World War I. And you will see 5 names down, the name of Carpenter Fred Painter, whose enlistment is recorded, and staff levels here are much reduced. Squire Jack, with no heirs, gave his home over for use as a convalescent hospital, subsequently renting out the house, gardens, and estate, and he moved to Italy. Though his tenants sustained Halligan's horticultural reputation for a little while, the extensive productive gardens were the first to fall into neglect, with the outdoor workforce slipping by the late 1950s to a mere 2 from 23. By 1974, Heligan House had been converted into 22 flats and sold off, retaining only the immediate surrounding gardens. So this is a photograph from the early 1990s of the northern gateway from the melon yard into the main kitchen garden, a scene of total neglect. And I note here, this is 1991. So when Tim Smith first came to Heligan with John Willis, who was a great nephew of the last resident squire, Jack Tremaine, they literally had to hack and climb, excuse me, sorry. It's not a tin of gin and tonic, by the way, this is actually water. They had to actually climb through a great tangle of self-set laurel, boundary laurel, but also self-set trees. And they found the entire site had been swamped above head height by bramble and enormous fallen trees. Tim Smith was a trained archaeologist and was inspired by the discovery of small artifacts which hinted at the previous lives here. Subsequent to that visit, Tim returned with a gentleman called John Nelson, who was a local builder. And the two of them cut their way into the melon yard, which is the real sort of working heart of the productive gardens. And the overgrown kitchen garden, as I described, is what we're looking at here through the gateway. So this is a photograph of exactly the same position, probably about 10 years later after the restoration. More than anything, Candy just wanted to include it in here as a bit of a before and after peek. But as we're looking at this view to the left, the melon yard buildings, there's a structure called the Thunderbox Room, which is what we'll talk about now. So these are signatures on the wall of the Thunderbox Room. So back in 1990, on another early exploration, Tim and John Nelson cleared a route through the undergrowth into the melon yard to a small cottage collapsed in the northeast corner. And this had been the gardener's night bothy at one point, but also their lavatory, which was known familiarly as the Thunderbox Room. Here, John Nelson excavated the rubble and gradually revealed these columns of signatures, which turned out to be signatures of the staff. And they were all inscribed in pencil, as you can see, on these flaking lime plaster walls. Under one column of signatures, they made out a date, and it was August 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. There and then, John and Tim both determined to restore the lost gardens in the name of these men, and not only structurally, but to full function. And this is the really important point that Susan touched on, reviving the range of traditional working practices of our forebears, but celebrating not just their skill and their knowledge, but also the year-round sheer hard labor that was expected of them. And here we have an outdoor staff team photo from the early 1900s. It's the only photo like this that we actually have of former Heligan outdoor staff. Fred Painter, who we mentioned earlier, stands second from left, next to his father, William, and he later signed his name in the Thunderbox Room. He fortunately returned pretty unscathed physically from his war service. And in due course, prompted by the World War I commemoration, his family got in touch with us, and we learned a lot from his son. But looking at the photo in front of us, the head gardener, Thomas William Preece, who sits in the center without his hat on, his descendants also helped enormously with the restoration in terms of understanding the previous staff. And we're very grateful to have, they donated his horticultural Bible, The Gardener's Assistant, which he had received as an apprentice in 1874. So we have a signed set of those in the library, which is fantastic. So here is the scene in the early 90s. These are the derelict glass houses, and in fact the Paxton glass house that Susan spoke of, swamped by overgrowth in the walled garden, in the flower garden. This is a setting where the previous photo of the team was taken almost a century ago. In the top left-hand corner of this aerial shot, there's a secondary door which opens into this glorious space. The story of the discovery and restoration of the lost gardens is well known, and some liken it to the romantic awakening of Sleeping Beauty. For the old pleasure grounds did indeed conceal some incredibly beautiful old specimens. However, the economic backdrop to our apparently romantic adventure was dire. So in 1990, the UK economy was in deep recession. Candy remembers Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher shutting down many of the traditional trades, shipbuilding, mining, printing, and her personal mortgage was on 17%, she wants you all to know. Unemployment had already run through generations in some families locally, and in any case, much employment in Cornwall had only ever been seasonal, tied as it was to tourism and fishing. Tim's project partner, builder John Nelson, had dozens of local contacts who were only too keen to join the adventure, bringing free labor, skills, equipment, and a well of endless energy and enthusiasm. It was not lost on us that most gardens open to the public at that time were managed by the National Trust, only open seasonally, and none considered the historic productive areas to be anything more useful for back-of-house parking. Hence, the seemingly enormous task of restoring this walled garden with its 3 historic glasshouse structures was driven by a number of motivations, triggered by contemporary circumstances. Any great garden, or indeed esteemed great family, is dependent on its staff. Here at Heligan, respect would uniquely be given where respect was due. Guided by a full restoration plan, we commenced work in the walled garden in late 1993 and delivered in a little more than a year. So this is the part of that restoration of the productive gardens, and there's a definite celebration of traditional working practices going on there. We had by now tracked down the Cornwall County Horticultural Advisor, Philip Macmillan Browse. He was the former head of Wisley Gardens for the RHS, and he had just retired back in his home county of Cornwall. Not only did he advise us on protecting the most precious veteran shrubs in the pleasure grounds, but he also undertook to mastermind the reclamation and replanting of the productive gardens. These included the full overgrown 1.8 acre plot of the kitchen garden, invaded by boundary laurel, the small walled melon yard where all the traditional work sheds and frames for propagation had been unveiled of their bramble blankets and excavated as well as the very early melon house and unique pineapple pit. And the walled garden with derelict glass houses had been largely untouched for decades. Once on the ground, the area was cleared and the structures were restored. An army of volunteers began to recultivate the inherited soil by hand. It has been our firm remit ever since not to bring machinery of any description onto the ground, but to treasure the soil as one of the three most valuable resources we have. The others being human input, labor and skill, knowledge, experience and endurance, and the critical, then to be rediscovered, heritage crop varieties. So this is the Heligan flower garden and glass houses restored to original function. The Paxton glass house to the left of the main one in front of us. So this was the scene in the walled garden in 1995, less than 2 years after it was reclaimed from the overgrowth. Citrus, vinery, and peach houses were restored by properly employed local craftsmen, heritage fruits replanted, and the ground filled with rows of sweet-scented traditional varieties of annual and perennial flowers, early salads, and herbs, all buzzing with pollinating insects in summer. And Candy rounds this off by saying, "I think this is my favorite place in the world," and thousands of others now say the same thing. So thank you for...
Thank you. Thank you.
Michelle, with questions.
Yeah, are there questions around?
Michelle, yes, there is one early question. Do you know who the lady was in the picture, in the photo?
Oh, well, excitingly, Lucy, we don't know her name. We have a suspicion we know who she is. But why I got all excited just then is that we're doing a bit of research into the old bothy. And we've been working with a historical archivist and looking at the lives of what the lives of the journeymen and young gardeners would have been like in the bothy. And we have an informed guess that she would have been described as mother. She would have quite probably been the lady who would have looked after the bothy, which would have meant coming in and cooking a couple of meals a day for the young lads, because some of the, as I'm sure you will know, some of the lads working in the garden might have been as young as 12. And a lot of bothies around the country with the better employers would have a lady who came and acted rather like a mother figure and was known as mother by the gardeners to look after the younger employees. The notion, her name escapes me now, but we suspect this is a lady we know about anyway, who lived down by Heligan Mill, which is a 20-minute walk from, and was sort of born and bred at Heligan.
There was a question, Alasdair, on the cost of all this. Renovation.
Well, the cost has been ongoing, but there were a number of. There was a grant involved. Forgive me, I haven't got those figures to hand, but I can find them out for you. But I think one of the important elements of what Candy was written about was the dependence of the restoration on voluntary help, and not just folk turning up with a packed lunch and a spade in their hands, and there were plenty of those, but also a willingness of people to lend heavy machinery and expertise and come and do a lot of work for free. I don't know, Nicola, if do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, no, that's my understanding of it as well, Alasdair, that, you know, it was a chance for people with amazing skill sets around the county that were unemployed, and it was a chance for them to sort of take part in the restoration. And I think gradually, as the restoration progressed and visitors came and Helgen started taking in money, then that labour force became a paid labour force. And I think that's pretty much, yeah, the start of it all.
Yes, thank you. Other questions? Lucy, Alexia, have you got
Yes.
things in the chat?
Yes, can I ask you, you use a lot of heritage crop varieties, but how do you know the traditional practice that they use there?
At the time of and Susan would be aware of this, but at the time just before the restoration, there'd been a real sort of flowering of interest in Victorian gardening, and particularly Victorian kitchen gardens. There's a name of a gentleman, Peter Thoday, who wrote extensively on this, but our aforementioned horticultural guru, Philip Macmillan Browse, did a vast amount of research looking at, I mean, we mentioned the gardener's assistant, as well as the development of incredible development of Victorian productive gardening. So there was a real flourishing of literature, of books that were genuinely the horticultural Bibles or Encyclopedia Britannicas of their day, where you would refer for guidance, both as a head gardener, but quite possibly as a owner of a garden. So there was a lot of information out there, which was then amalgamated at Helgen to sort of try and represent the real kind of apex point of late Victorian Edwardian productive gardening. So it was a assimilation of a lot of information that was available through archive and through literature. I don't know, Nicola, if you want
Yeah, no, Philip has amassed us a fantastic library, and we still have that on site today, which we refer to all the time. You know, as we continue with the project, it's our reference still today. Those original books written by head gardeners of the day for other head gardeners, you know, just sort of share their skills and knowledge. So yes, we constantly refer back to that library that we have.
And it's great, just reminded me, Nicola, that it was only a few weeks ago that Nicola and I were actually in there. We were looking at, you know, what notion of cover crops might have been absorbed into sort of rotations and horticultural practices in the 19th century, and it was very illuminating. But we're still, you know, even when we're thinking how can we apply what we perceive as modern techniques of soil management to the productive garden, we're going back to those points of reference to see what we can find.
Yes, a last question before we break.
A question in the question and answer, actually. Are the glass panels in the glass house, so Paxton's restored, are the panels in the glass house sliding from top to bottom? Do you
The actual frames, do you mean? Yeah, so we have, so the top vents that you can see that are open are on a pulley system. So this is actually where you see that this isn't the Paxton glasshouse, this is the Citrus house. The Paxton glasshouse is just further on, that's sort of slightly lower on the end, and that's quite a different system. It has a length of long vents running down, all the way down, and you open them up as windows. They have catches on them and you open them upwards and outwards, and there's a top one and a bottom one. So they're actually quite an arduous task opening them and closing them each day, because you have to open the top one first before you can open the bottom one. So whereas these ones on a slightly later version of a glass house, they're on a pulley system and you just literally slide them up and down. So on the original Paxton glass house, they are opening windows with catches and very long thin windows that run down the center of the glass houses.
Okay, so thank you so much. So shall we do a short break, 5 minutes, and we restart with Nicola? That's correct?
Excellent.
Yes, lovely.
So 5 minutes.
Okay.
See you back in 5 minutes.
Wonderful. Okay.
Lucy, I don't manage to upgrade Christopher Vedel to panelist. I'm trying hard, but I don't know what happens. It's the technology resists. I will try again.
Otherwise, could I just forward him the link?
Yes,
that we...
do that, please.
Thank you.
No, yeah, I'm not sure that try that, yeah.
Okay, he might have to change his name.
So Nicola,
Hello.
the present is in color.
Yes. More colourful slides.
More colorful slide. Yeah. So I think we can get started again.
Okay.
So please, the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Bradley, and I head up the garden team here at Heligan. But I actually joined Heligan back in 2006 on the productive team. And obviously at that time, as we discussed earlier, mentioned Philip McMillan-Browse. So he'd already created the vision and the working plan for the productive gardens. And as Alasdair mentioned, the aim was very much about recreating a really good working example of a kitchen garden when they were in their heyday. So this is going to span across both the Victorian and Edwardian periods. So my role has always been very much about protecting those already established ways of working, but also aiming to develop and improve on them wherever possible. So, oops. Sorry, just technology here. Oh, that's it. Sorry, get there. So this here is a photograph of part of the kitchen garden. So we've got the kitchen garden and the melon yard in a little bit more detail here. But as these images show, a beautiful, productive garden, but a very complicated creature. So I think it was very clear to me when I first arrived that the devil was really going to be about the detail. So that, you know, was a really important part of keeping the restoration true. And having the right number of staff working in the garden's always been essential. So it's managing all of the tasks that we do carried out by hand in a very laborious way, and obviously to an incredibly high standard. And that just wouldn't be possible without our team of 9 gardeners. So we have 9 productive gardeners. And we've been incredibly lucky over the years, over the last 30 years, that that's been recognised, and we're still given the budget to maintain that number of paid gardeners. So, you know, as well, I think that's been a huge part of our success. And because factoring in as well the time that our gardeners spend talking to visitors on busy days, they can literally be talking to hundreds and hundreds of visitors. So that you know, that is a big thing to take into account time-wise. So once again, this image of the flower garden shows how much detail is involved in these working areas. So again, key to our success has been maintaining a skilled workforce. We need to constantly and really consistently share all our gained knowledge between our gardeners. And we realise how precious and fragile that is. It's so easy to lose this knowledge if long-standing experienced team members leave. And we've had some big changes in the team over the last few years, and that has been obviously COVID and various other factors. So we find ourselves again in this position where we need to work really hard to ensure that everyone understands how the small individual elements add up to create the whole picture. So we're always aiming to champion the traditional skills, but we want to empower our gardeners to have the skills to create a garden that they're really proud of. That's really important for us. So this is a photograph of Philip. We've talked a lot about Philip. Obviously, I must put a photo in because he's so important to the restoration. But at the start of the restoration, one of the biggest challenges for Philip was sourcing the many heritage varieties that would have been grown at Heligan. And these varieties at that time had really fallen out of favour for more commercially produced crops, and were in many cases very difficult to find. So not only did Philip search the length and breadth of this country for seed, he also looked as far away as Australia to source rainbow chard. So he really did leave no stone unturned in the search for finding and restocking the varieties that we grow at Heligan. So today, our very detailed cropping schedule is often quite a challenge, but very satisfying when it all goes to plan. We grow nearly 500 different varieties of fruits, vegetables, herbs, cut flowers, and these are all about 95% of what we grow are heritage varieties, and they would have been available to pre-1910. We do save some seed, mainly varieties of peas, beans and potatoes that are no longer commercially available, but we have very simple seed saving facilities. So where we can, we'll always buy in fresh viable seed. And so hunting down these old varieties continues to be quite a challenge. And it would be very easy to be seduced and tempted by all the modern varieties that are available. But we're very disciplined and quite strict with ourselves on that, because it would be, if we started introducing them, that would really dilute what we do. So it's, you know, so that can prove quite frustrating for some gardeners. For us, we feel we enjoy the challenge, but for some people that's quite a frustration, the ties of sticking to heritage. So it's not for everyone, the constraints of a Victorian kitchen garden. And also that applies to the very meticulous methods that we use for, you know, for growing and planting out. It's all done with great exactitude. So string lines and tape measures are very much a part of our kit. So just looking at this drawing, it does look like a very grand plan, but I think our visitors still really connect with it. It's a very photograph plan. Wherever we put it, people photograph it all the time, because it's really easy to copy the idea, to take the crop rotation, scale it down, use the simple hand tools that we use. So, you know, even in a very small garden, people can create their own mini Heligan. And I think many of our visitors have done this, and they return year after year to look for inspiration. So this picture here, this is Craig, one of our gardeners, and he's working in the potting shed. And I think this really symbolises our ethos at Heligan. So gardeners today working in these spaces just as they would have done over 100 years ago. And as Susan was talking earlier about the needs of working in a modern garden, you know, we're very definitely gardening in the 21st century. So there is an element of theatre about what we do to create that atmosphere of lost time. So the tools that we use are modern tools. They're fully functioning, strong. They get a lot of use. They can't be delicate antiques. But I think the key is to remove as much as possible all the materials that are going to interrupt that timeless feel. So we use wooden handled tools, metal buckets, Hessian sacking, wooden harvesting crates, you know, definitely no brightly coloured buckets or trugs or water bottles left on shelves along with mobile phone, anything that can take you out of that moment. It's really important. And again, you know, just small details, but they really make a difference. So most of our workspaces are open and visible to our visitors. We don't hide away behind the scenes. You know, people love to watch us working and ask questions, and the potting shed in particular, people seem to enter it with a sense of awe. It feels very special to be going in there. So I think creating these atmospheric spaces is something that's always been felt very important at Heligan, and the photographs of the old gardeners and simple pots of fresh flowers around, small tributes, but they provide really poignant moments that generally move people. And that strong connection to the gardener's past is something that, again, visitors, you can tell, you know, they really appreciate that. So alongside the theatre of what we do, there is of course much serious horticulture taking place, and all the traditional skills and practices can be seen clearly in our historic glass houses with train vines and peaches. And here in the melon yard, we can see our trained espalier wall fruits behind the very orderly cold frames where all the crops are hardening off to go out. And melons and cucumbers trained in the melon house, all of these showcasing the skills of the gardeners in the 19th century and their ingenuity to recreate the growing conditions for what were then highly prized and exotic crops. And as Susan has already mentioned, you know, one of our most iconic crops which illustrate these traditional practices perfectly are of course our pineapples. So back in the early days of the restoration, the original garden team set out to grow a crop of pineapples just using the hot fresh manure, purely the hot manure. And the manpower involved today is just as labour intensive as it would have been in the 1800s. So 90 tonnes of fresh, very fresh horse manure would be shoveled in by hand over the winter months. And that all goes into the trenches that run alongside the pineapple pit. So with these newly learned skills, because it was took quite some time to work out how to manage the heat from these big piles of manure, they did, the original teams achieved their first successful crop. And that's over 25 years ago now. And over the last 2 decades, it's become increasingly difficult. I mean, now really very difficult to source such quantities of fresh manure locally. And obviously not a problem that the Victorians would have had at all, that would have had easy access to this source of heat. But we've had to start searching further and further afield to bring that on site. And again, you know, sort of talking about gardening in the 21st century, it's something that we are very aware of in this modern world, that we need to start thinking about the resources that we use, and particularly a crop like the pineapples, you know, and the carbon footprint that we create in the process. So we do feel quite, you know, strongly that now is the time to start thinking about how we continue to grow these crops, but very much honouring the tradition, but perhaps creating the heat in a more sustainable way. So lots of questions about how we move forward, how we do this, but it's quite a powerful example of how we need to protect all the legacy of all these heritage skills, but be very mindful about, you know, our planet's future. So it's a really sort of strong representation of that for us, in particular the pineapples. And I'd also like to just talk briefly about our produce, obviously our wonderful produce that we produce. So our main aim is to provide the kitchen with as much as possible. And we have in previous years harvested up to about 5,000 kilos of crops that go into our kitchens, and they can be used in many different ways. So we use the produce in our daily menus, Sunday lunches, Christmas dinners, feast nights, and our new head chef Nat has just started monthly supper nights, and so she's elevated our produce to the fine dining menu for the first time, which is great for the gardeners to see it used in that way and focused on so intensely as well, which is fantastic. But it's not always easy, you know, as it would seem, to make sure that the crops all make it to the kitchen, even as it's on our own doorstep. But on a typical summer's day, our really busy kitchen team could be attempting to feed over 2,000 visitors. And with the best will in the world, you know, they're not able to sort of shell crates and crates of beans and on a day like that. So when we have these gluts and the kitchens aren't able to deal with them, we tend to place them in wheelbarrows and offer them to our visitors, just to help themselves. And, you know, we have thought about selling excess produce, but I think we decided that those sort of acts of generosity were just worth far more. It's such a lovely surprise for visitors. It adds to their experience, and it helps engage them with our produce in the most direct way. So, you know, it's a real pleasure as a gardener to pick strawberries or peaches on a warm day, and somebody's just sitting having a moment in their flower garden and you hand them a peach to eat. It's a lovely thing. It's a lovely shared experience. And again, that's something that we value very highly. And finally, very traditionally, all the labours of the season are celebrated annually in our October Harvest Festival events. So again, free tasting sessions where visitors enjoy little treats sort of prepared by the tea rooms with our with produce from Heligan. And we do appreciate that we're lucky enough not to have to rely on an income from the produce we produce in the kitchen garden, which I know for a lot of other kitchen gardens that isn't the case. So giving away so much may seem a little bit rash, but the ticket sales and add-on spends in retail and catering cover the costs of the gardens, which mean that we do have the luxury of this type of visitor engagement with our produce, which has been really successful for us. So Heligan's always been about people as well as produce. So everybody who has worked here in the past and people who work here now, all the visitors who share that experience. And I think for us, one of the key successes of Heligan to continue to be, you know, a very popular garden, that type of engagement has played a huge success in our continued role over the last 30 years. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Questions? I'm sure there are plenty of questions around.
Yes, Michelle.
Yeah. Lucy?
So first question, approximately how many visitors do you have a year, an average year?
Yeah, so about an average, it's about 360,000. Yeah, about 360,000. Yeah, obviously much busier in the summer months, but increasingly as Cornwall has become very busy in the last couple of years, whereas we would have had a sort of a more gentle run into that really busy period in the summer, we have a very constant sort of autumn, a spring, summer, autumn, and now, you know, winter. Numbers have definitely increased.
Can you tell us the ticket price?
Ticket price, Alasdair, goodness, he's got, it's a new ticket price, that's why I'm looking at Alasdair.
So we have
approximate.
Yeah.
We've very consciously increased the ticket price quite a lot in the past 2 years. So last year it was £19.50 in the height of the season. And this year it will be £22.50. And part of that seems like a lot of money to some, but part of the reasoning behind that is in order, you know, to increase the paying conditions of the garden staff, which is really, and the staff in general. But also we're striving to make Heligan somewhere that you can easily come and spend, you know, 4 or 5 hours in. And once you kind of incorporate that into the ticket price, it sort of makes sense. And of course, Heligan is, though the productive garden is absolutely at the kind of center of everything, it's quite a big site. We have a farm, we have a number, you know, large ornamental gardens and woodland and all that sort of thing.
No, but you should not be apologetic. it's fantastic success, and success doesn't come easily. So you have to make sure that you create a sustainable business. Oh, great. Well, have a question, Lucy?
Yes, Vim Claire, he's asked, it would be interesting to have information of the design and construction for phases, cost, a number of contractors or volunteers involved in the project. So perhaps we could pull something, a little bit of information together afterwards with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and to be honest, this is, it's probably a weakness that we have, is that Candy, having been part of it from the very beginning. But I would like to just make one point about volunteers, is that though absolutely at the beginning of the restoration, it wouldn't have happened without volunteers. I am very clear that we do not have volunteers working in the gardens doing the job that should be done by paid horticulturalists. We have a few that come in who are coming in for their health. It's a sort of well-being thing. I am very interested in developing kind of volunteers doing jobs that we simply wouldn't pay anyone to do, such as going out to the woodlands and collecting perennial wildflower seed, or doing wildlife surveys, that sort of thing. But I'm quite firm, and I don't particularly like gardens that rely upon volunteers, because what we're about at Heligan, and what we should all be about, is respecting horticultural trade and professionals, and people need to be paid to do the jobs that we want them to do, and not rely on the kind of good offices of volunteers.
That's a very strong message, Alasdair. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, we all agree.
But yes, that's fine. I'll put some information together for you.
Thank you, Nicola. Alex asked whether the other lamps that you've got in the potting shed in your picture, are they oil lamps?
It is electric. So this is part of the theatre, again, because modern health and safety working conditions. So when there aren't gardeners working in there, we just literally have them, and they're very low wattage, and they do look like little oil lamps hanging, but it's really dark in there. So when, thinking of our gardeners' eyes these days, they didn't care back then, but we do have to think about things like that. So there is very discreet additional lighting, that because our guys do, that is genuinely the potting shed. Everyone spends hours in there, especially this time of year, pricking out and potting on. So it's things like that we were talking about, very discreet lighting where you can put extra lighting on so the guys can work safely, comfortably, they can see, and then that gets turned off again. So yeah, so it is electric, and again, just for health and safety, we have to abide by all modern working legislation, and that does limit a lot of what we do, and we have to be quite creative as to how we do things that still look authentic.
There's another question. Could you just remind us of the area of the flower garden and the main vegetable garden, and the wall garden?
So the vegetable garden, the kitchen garden at the top, is about 1.8 acres, and I think the flower garden is probably just under an acre, isn't it? I think in total it's about 3 acres, the whole area, melon yard, vegetable garden and kitchen garden. So
about 1.5 hectares, probably.
Yeah.
There are some more. Do you sell your own plants, or do you buy in the shop?
So in our plant sales, we do buy in. We don't produce any plants commercially. We did quite a few years ago. We had a nursery, but it was very hard to and because we have Phytophthora as well, on site. We're quite strict about, we have to have any plant material whatsoever that's here grown on site. If we take it off site, we have to have plant health inspections before that goes. So it's kept quite separate, the nursery too. So everything that we grow in the productive gardens is all grown here on site from seed, but we certainly don't sell any of that on then to visitors. Because we don't have the space to, we've got enough space to produce what we put in the garden. Beyond that, we don't have any more space as well, really.
I have a question actually. In the early days, did you work with the with Garden Organic with the Heritage Seed Library to find old varieties?
I think so. I think with I mean, Alice is going to talk slightly a little bit about that later, but yes, we have had links to the Heritage Seed Library and continue to have that, and it's something that as we move forward, we're interested to improve and increase on that as well. So.
Sarah, a comment on or questions on volunteers? You posted something. Sarah?
How did you know, Michelle? Jim and I were just talking about it because, of course, we adopted a different approach at West.
So Sarah and Jim are from West Dean, for those of you who would not know.
Kitchen garden, wonderful. Stunning kitchen garden. I love, that was my inspiration as a student, your garden.
Well, thank you very much. Our approach was different to yours, Alasdair. I don't really know what to say about it, but in the end, I found that volunteers were an integral part of what we did. We would not have been able to achieve anything like we were able to achieve without volunteers. And there wasn't a hope of employing more gardeners to cover the work that they did. So that, as you rightly say, the devil's in the detail, and the detail was often provided by volunteers that just spent time doing jobs, repetitively, for an afternoon that a gardener couldn't, because of all the other things that they had to do and the way that they had to move over the site, just couldn't dedicate the time to it. So we just didn't have the time, whereas volunteers were so willing to do this work, alongside us. And I was eternally grateful for their contribution and, remain that way. Nevertheless, I fully support your vision that gardeners should be well paid. And I'm so sick that they're not really, that they're the lowest of the low when they provide so much for everybody to see and enjoy.
No, and thank you, Sarah. I just sort of make clear again, we wouldn't have got anywhere without volunteers at the beginning. The restoration was really, really dependent on the goodwill of others, and it's why it was also important to mention the kind of the terrible state of the local and national economy at the time, that there were loads of people who were not employed looking for work. So no, I have to kind of emphasize that, but also part of the very reason that Heligan was restored, that whole kind of link back to the signatures on the Thunderbox and all that sort of thing, was about the working gardener. And I just feel for us, it would be an utter betrayal of that respect that we're trying to show, the raison d'etre of the restoration, if we kind of went for volunteers above paid professional gardeners. So I'm definitely not, I'm not kind of raging against anyone who does. It's just for us, I think there has to be a line that is very clearly drawn.
And I think that shows your unique situation at Heligan. The way that you started, the origin of the redevelopment and the restoration of the garden, is unique. And at West Dean, we were what's the word, conditioned by other forces. You know, we were part of a larger organization to start off with. So, you know, we came at it at a slightly different angle. And interestingly, at the same time as Heligan, you know, so we were developing more or less, you know, concurrently.
No, so I'm happy to make a link with Chambord. I'm sure that in Chambord we'll discuss a lot again this issue and this issue of volunteers and their role, and also I think something that we are going to discuss is the role of gardeners, because I think that's something we have discovered all along this cycle of conferences, that gardeners need to be more recognized than they are today, because without gardeners we would never have any of your gardens around. So that's a very important issue to be discussed in Chambord, and I'm sure we'll have very interesting discussions on this theme. So thanks for bringing that. And again, there are many ways to do things. There are many roads to success.
Absolutely.
Michel, can I just, I'll try and say it in English rather than reading it in French, because that would be silly with all of you there. Jacques Soignon has just said, don't forget about the other incredible areas that make up the Lost Gardens of Heligan, and the spring, the beautiful giant rhododendrons, and other activities. Une belle révélation faite par un visionnaire, Tim Smith.
But Jacques, you can speak. You have the status of panelist. So Jacques, if you are around, Jacques Soignon, Jacques, okay, Jacques will say a word later. Yeah. Okay.
Bien activer mon micro. Je ne sais pas
si
ça fonctionne.
Voilà, Jacques. So Jacques Soignon is from Nantes. Jacques Soignon was the former head of the Gardens and Nature at Nantes.
Yeah.
And he's also the vice president of CCVS, an organization that let's say, organizes the conservation of varieties and species, vegetal species. So Jacques, you wanted to make a comment.
Je ne sais pas si mon micro fonctionne.
I don't know if my mic works.
It works.
It actually works.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so nice to be with you today and to share this very good. To be with you for that, and just I have the luck to visit to have visited this nice garden in Heligan with Tim Smith, and so I think something very interesting to say is that it's a really incredible mixing of very precise agriculture, but also of a former jungle. So it's really original.
Thank you, Jacques. The connection is not very good, but
I think it's something to consider how to maintain this strange equilibrium between these two sides of this park. So maybe it's something you have to explain us.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you, Jacques. And if I understand correctly, we're talking about the relationship between the as you so nicely put it, the sort of precise horticulture and the more kind of free form of the ornamental areas. And I think in a way it's not. I never see it as a conflict, particularly because I think it was ever thus that the kind of the heart of the productive garden though it is, you know, beautiful in its order and regimen, that was all about purpose, and that was all about feeding as many mouths for the longest period of time, season after season. And I hope this is I'm answering the question you're posing. Whereas certainly the more ornamental areas, as they strayed out into the estate and the woodland, they by definition became looser, and the plant palette that was being drawn upon, particularly those the rhododendrons that have their base in rhododendron arboreum, we've got loads of cultivars, etc., are these great sort of tree rhododendrons. But I think it's also reflective of Heligan as an estate, that and the phases of horticultural fashion that the estate and garden passed through over the, you know, from 1600 to 1914, and encompassed and lost in the valleys and the woodlands are attempts at a sort of Fermornay and the sort of touches of 18th century landscape gardening. And the jungle you spoke of initially was a sort of quasi, I don't know, hybrid between a garden with Japanese influences, but also something of an arboretum of North American conifers. And this all kind of occurred at the end of the 19th century. So it is, by its nature, it is that kind of juxtaposition, but also a layer on top of that is trying to hold on to some of the lostness of 1990. And there are areas in the ornamental garden near to the productive garden where we hang on to a sense of things being lost, areas where, you know, the things aren't cleaned in the same way. There's still mossy rock. We've got a early 19th century grotto, but that's left quite mossy and dark and unrestored. You've got access to it, but if you find yourself on your own in the grotto for the first time, it will feel like you've just discovered something that nobody knows about. So we try and play with that, but again, much as Nicola touched on, there's that theatre. Nicola, you may well want to say.
Well, what's really interesting as well is the last you know, couple of years, and obviously with the pandemic, and initially when there weren't gardeners in Heligan for a while, and some of the areas that were in the ornamental areas had been left again, and even just in that short period of time had become a little bit more naturalized. And actually walking back into that, it was quite an interesting thing that we realized that there were some areas that we'd maybe had over gardened, and not the productive gardens, but within, you know, within the outer ornamental gardens, and that slightly naturalizing again was a really lovely thing, and we decided to stick with that again. So it's interesting how it is always a balance, and you can quite easily just slightly tip it the wrong way. So yeah, it's a constant. But what's great as well is we've got some of our gardeners. Mary's been with us for nearly the 30 years, and she will say, if you're, you know, it's like, no, don't do that, you know. So there's many generations of gardeners here that have been here from the beginning, or, you know, or for 20 years or 10 years. So that constant input from people who have an affinity with the garden at different stages as well really does help us keep, you know, hopefully the personality of the garden, and the gardeners who've worked there as well, that's very much their personality remains in the garden as well.